Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to this gentle journey through time. Thank you ever so much for clicking on this video and choosing to spend these quiet moments with me. If this story brings you comfort and rest, do consider giving it a gentle like and perhaps subscribe for more soothing tales from history's pages. But for now, simply settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your breathing slow as we drift back through the centuries together. Tonight, we shall wander through the life of one of history's most remarkable minds, Sir Isaac Newton, but we shall do so softly, like walking through a moonlit garden where every flower holds a story. We'll explore not just his discoveries that changed our understanding of the universe, but the gentle rhythms of his daily life, the world he inhabited, and the quiet moments that shaped the man behind the legend. So close your eyes if you wish, let your muscles relax, and allow yourself to be carried away on this peaceful journey through time. Our story begins on a cold winter's day in the year 1642, when England was a very different place than the world we know today. It was Christmas Day according to the old calendar, then in use, though by our modern reckoning it would have been January the 4th, 1643. The difference comes from England's stubborn adherence to the Julian calendar, while much of Europe had already adopted the Gregorian system, but such details need not trouble us now. What matters is that on this bitter winter morning, in the small village of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, a baby was born who would one day unlock the secrets of the cosmos. The village of Woolsthorpe was the sort of place where time seemed to move more slowly than in the bustling cities. Sheep grazed in rolling green meadows that stretched to the horizon, their bells tinkling softly in the morning mist. Ancient stone walls meandered across the countryside like sleeping serpents, dividing field from field in patterns that had remained unchanged for centuries. The Newton family's manor house stood sturdy and welcoming, built of the warm, honey-coloured limestone that characterised the region. Its windows, small and diamond-paned, caught the light in ways that seemed almost magical, casting gentle rainbows across the interior walls when the sun struck them just so. Hannah Ayscough Newton, Isaac's mother, was a woman of quiet strength and intelligence. She had been widowed just 3 months before her son's birth, when her husband Isaac Newton the elder passed away at the tender age of 36. The loss had been devastating, leaving Hannah to face the challenges of motherhood alone, but she carried herself with the dignity and resilience that seemed to run in the Ayscough family like a gentle stream through fertile ground. The baby who entered the world that cold December morning was so tiny and fragile that few expected him to survive his first day, let alone grow to manhood. He was born prematurely, so small that it was said he could have fit inside a quart pot. The local women who attended the birth shook their heads sadly, whispering that such a frail child could never thrive in the harsh English winter. They had seen too many infants lost to the cold and disease that stalked the countryside like persistent shadows, but little Isaac possessed a tenacious spirit that would define his entire life, clinging to existence with the same determination he would later bring to understanding the laws of nature. Hannah wrapped her tiny son in the softest woolen blanket she could find, keeping him close to the warmth of the great fireplace that dominated the main room of the manor. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth, sending dancing shadows across the stone walls, and filling the room with the comforting scent of burning oak. She would spend hours rocking him gently by that fire, humming old Lincolnshire lullabies that her own mother had sung to her, watching his small chest rise and fall with each precious breath. The England of Isaac's birth was a nation in turmoil, though the disturbances of the wider world touched the quiet village of Woolsthorpe only like distant thunder on a summer evening. King Charles I sat uneasily on the throne, his relationship with Parliament growing more strained with each passing month. Religious tensions simmered beneath the surface of daily life like water beginning to boil, as Puritans and Anglicans eyed each other with increasing suspicion. But in the peaceful countryside of Lincolnshire, such matters seemed as remote as the stars themselves, and life continued much as it had for generations past. The manor house where Isaac spent his earliest years was a world unto itself, filled with the sounds and scents of rural English life. In the mornings, the air would fill with the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, their hooves creating a gentle rhythm on the cobblestone yard. The household roosters would announce each dawn with proud proclamations that echoed across the misty fields, while barn cats stretched and yawned in patches of sunlight that streamed through half-open doors. Hannah tended to the daily running of the small estate with careful attention, ensuring that the tenant farmers who worked the land were treated fairly and that the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest proceeded smoothly. As little Isaac grew from a sickly infant into a more robust toddler, his mother began to notice something quite remarkable about her son. While other children his age were content to play with simple toys carved from wood or fashioned from scraps of cloth, Isaac seemed drawn to objects that moved in interesting ways. He would spend long minutes watching dust motes dance in shafts of sunlight, following their lazy pirouettes with eyes that held an intensity unusual in one so young. When Hannah wound the small mechanical clock that graced the mantelpiece, Isaac would toddle over and press his ear to its wooden case, listening to the steady tick-tock with the sort of focused attention that most children reserved for sweet treats or favourite stories. The seasons turned slowly in Lincolnshire, each bringing its own gentle rhythms and quiet pleasures. Spring arrived with the soft bleating of newborn lambs and the sweet fragrance of apple blossoms that drifted from the manor's small orchard like nature's own perfume. Isaac, now walking steadily if still quite small for his age, would follow his mother through the garden as she tended to her herbs and vegetables. She would name each plant for him in her soft, melodious voice: lavender and rosemary, thyme and sage, each word rolling off her tongue like a gentle incantation. The boy seemed to absorb these lessons with remarkable ease, his mind apparently cataloguing and organizing information in ways that would have impressed learned scholars. Summer brought long, warm days when the countryside hummed with insect life and the air shimmered with heat waves that made distant objects dance like mirages. Isaac would often be found sitting in the shade of the great oak tree that dominated the manor's front yard, a massive specimen that had been growing there since before anyone could remember. Its trunk was so wide that it would have taken 4 grown men holding hands to encircle it, and its branches spread out like protective arms, creating a natural pavilion where the temperature was always several degrees cooler than in the open sun. Here, Isaac would arrange small stones and sticks in patterns that seemed to make sense only to him, his small fingers working with surprising precision as he created what might have been his first experiments in geometry and physics. When autumn arrived with its palette of gold and crimson, the manor would fill with the bustling activity of harvest time. Tenant farmers would bring their grain to be weighed and stored, their carts creaking under loads of wheat and barley that would sustain the community through the coming winter. Isaac watched these proceedings with fascination, particularly interested in the scales used to measure the grain. He seemed to understand intuitively that the balance of the scales represented something fundamental about the world, though he was still far too young to articulate such thoughts in words. Winter in Lincolnshire could be harsh, with winds that swept down from the North Sea carrying the bite of ice and snow. But inside the manor, life continued its peaceful rhythm. The great fireplace would be kept burning throughout the coldest months, its warmth reaching into every corner of the main room and creating a cozy sanctuary against the elements outside. Hannah would tell her son stories on these long winter nights, tales of ancient kings and brave knights, of distant lands where palm trees grew and the sun never set. Isaac would listen with rapt attention, though even then his questions often focused on the practical aspects of the stories. How did the ships navigate across the vast oceans? What made some materials harder than others? Why did the sun appear to move across the sky? By the time Isaac reached his 3rd birthday, it was clear that his mind worked in ways quite different from other children. While his playmates were content with simple games of hide-and-seek or rolling hoops, Isaac preferred to spend his time examining the mechanical workings of everyday objects. He would study the hinges on doors with the intensity of a master craftsman, running his small fingers along the metal joints and pushing the doors back and forth to observe how the weight was distributed. The village blacksmith, a gentle giant named Thomas who had known Isaac's father, would sometimes allow the boy to watch him work, though always from a safe distance. Isaac was mesmerized by the sight of red-hot iron being shaped by hammer and anvil, the way the metal would glow and spark, gradually cooling from bright orange to deep red to dull grey as it gave up its heat to the surrounding air. It was during this early period of Isaac's life that Hannah made a decision that would profoundly affect her son's future, though its full implications would not become clear for many years. In 1645, when Isaac was just 3 years old, she accepted a marriage proposal from Barnabas Smith, the rector of nearby North Witham. Barnabas was a kind and learned man, well regarded in the community for his scholarship and gentle temperament. But he was also significantly older than Hannah, nearly twice her age, and he made it clear that he was not prepared to take on the raising of another man's child as part of their marriage bargain. The negotiations surrounding this marriage were handled with the careful delicacy that characterized such arrangements in those days. Barnabas offered to provide generously for Isaac's future education and financial security, but the boy would need to remain at Woolsthorpe under the care of his maternal grandmother, Marjorie Iscus. This arrangement was not uncommon in families of modest means, and Hannah undoubtedly felt that she was securing the best possible future for her son, while also providing herself with companionship and security in her own later years. The day came when Hannah gathered her few personal belongings and prepared to move to North Witham to begin her new life as Mrs. Smith. Isaac, now a thoughtful child of 3, seemed to understand that something significant was happening. Though the full meaning of the change remained beyond his grasp, he watched from the window of the great room as his mother's trunk was loaded onto a cart, her best dresses and precious few books carefully wrapped in linen to protect them during the short journey. Hannah knelt down to embrace her son, holding him close and whispering promises that she would visit often and that this separation was only temporary, though both of them somehow sensed that their relationship would never again be quite the same. As the cart carrying his mother disappeared down the lane that led away from Woolsthorpe, Isaac felt the first stirrings of an emotion that would colour much of his later life, a profound sense of abandonment that would make him wary of forming deep emotional attachments, and would drive him to seek security and understanding in the unchanging laws of mathematics and natural philosophy. But he was too young to understand such complex feelings, and instead he simply pressed his face to the cool glass of the window and watched until even the dust raised by the cart's wheels had settled back onto the road. Marjorie Iscus proved to be a loving and capable guardian for her grandson, though her approach to child-rearing was quite different from Hannah's, where Hannah had been gentle and permissive, allowing Isaac to pursue his curiosities at his own pace. Marjorie believed in structure and discipline. She established regular routines for meals, lessons, and bedtime, creating a framework that would serve Isaac well in his later academic pursuits. Each morning would begin with prayers and Bible reading, followed by a simple breakfast of porridge and milk, fresh bread and butter when it was available. Marjorie would then set Isaac small tasks appropriate to his age, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, or helping to tend the kitchen garden that provided vegetables for their table. Under his grandmother's care, Isaac began to develop the methodical habits that would characterize his approach to scientific investigation throughout his life. When given a task, he would not simply complete it quickly and move on to play, as most children would do. Instead, he would perform his duties with careful attention to detail, often improving upon the methods he had been taught. When gathering eggs, for instance, he noticed that the chickens tended to lay more frequently in certain nest boxes than in others, and he began to experiment with rearranging the straw and adjusting the lighting to see if he could influence their behavior. His grandmother watched these early experiments with a mixture of pride and puzzlement, recognizing that her grandson possessed an unusual mind but not yet understanding the full implications of his intellectual gifts. The village of Woolsthorpe provided Isaac with a perfect laboratory for his developing curiosity about the natural world. The countryside was filled with streams and ponds where he could observe the behavior of water, noting how it always flowed downhill and how it formed different patterns when it encountered obstacles in its path. He would spend hours by the small brook that ran through the manor's property, dropping leaves and twigs into the current and watching how they moved. Sometimes he would build small dams from mud and stones, then observe what happened when the water pressure became too great for his constructions to withstand. These were not mere childish games, but genuine investigations into the principles of fluid dynamics, though Isaac would not learn the formal terminology for such studies for many years to come. The changing seasons continued to mark the passage of time in their ancient rhythm, and Isaac grew from a small, serious child into a lanky boy with penetrating eyes and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of the world around him. His grandmother began to teach him his letters and numbers using a horn book, a wooden paddle with a sheet of paper protected by a thin layer of transparent horn that contained the alphabet and simple numerical tables. Isaac mastered these basics with remarkable speed, and Marjorie soon realized that her grandson would need more advanced instruction than she could provide. When Isaac was 7 years old, arrangements were made for him to attend the small school in nearby Skillington, about 5 miles from Woolsthorpe. The schoolmaster there was a man named Mr. Burton, who had received his education at Cambridge University and was known throughout the district for his learning and patience with young students. The school itself was a simple one-room building with thick stone walls and small windows that admitted just enough light for reading during the shorter days of winter. A large fireplace at one end provided warmth, though the boys who sat furthest from it often had to blow on their fingers to keep them nimble enough for writing. Isaac's daily journey to school became an adventure in itself, though not always a pleasant one. Each morning he would set out on foot across the fields and lanes that connected Woolsthorpe to Skillington, carrying his few books and writing materials in a leather satchel that had belonged to his father. The walk took him through countryside that changed dramatically with the seasons, muddy and slippery in spring when the fields were being ploughed, dusty and hot in summer when the grain stood tall and golden, crisp and invigorating in autumn when the leaves crunched beneath his feet, cold and sometimes treacherous in winter when ice made the pathways dangerous. At school, Isaac quickly distinguished himself as an exceptional student, though not always in ways that endeared him to his classmates. While other boys struggled with basic arithmetic, Isaac seemed to understand mathematical concepts almost instinctively. When Mr. Burton introduced the class to simple geometry, demonstrating how to construct basic shapes with compass and straight edge, Isaac not only mastered the techniques immediately, his fellow students sometimes resented his apparent effortlessness with subjects that they found challenging, and Isaac's natural shyness and serious demeanor did little to help him fit in with boys who were more interested in games and mischief than in academic pursuits. The social dynamics of the village school provided Isaac with some of his first lessons in human nature, though these were often painful experiences that reinforced his tendency toward solitude. There was one boy in particular, a farmer's son named Arthur Storer, who was larger and more aggressive than the others, who seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting Isaac. Arthur would hide Isaac's books, knock his writing slate to the floor, or push him into muddy puddles on the way to and from school. These encounters taught Isaac that intelligence alone was not always sufficient to navigate the complexities of human relationships, and they may have contributed to his lifelong wariness of controversy and his preference for the predictable world of mathematical principles over the chaotic realm of social interaction. But Isaac was not content to remain a victim of such treatment, and he began to apply the same methodical approach to dealing with Arthur that he brought to his academic studies. He observed his tormentor carefully, noting patterns in his behavior and looking for weaknesses that might be exploited. Isaac realized that while Arthur was physically stronger, he was also considerably less intelligent, and his aggression often got him into trouble with Mr. Burton. Isaac began to position himself strategically during lessons and at recess, staying close to the schoolmaster when possible, and avoiding the isolated areas where Arthur's bullying was most likely to occur. The turning point in their relationship came during a mathematics lesson, when Mr. Burton posed a particularly challenging problem involving the calculation of areas and volumes. Arthur, struggling with the basic concepts, grew frustrated and began to make mocking comments about Isaac's intense concentration on the problem. Isaac, normally reluctant to draw attention to himself, found his patience finally exhausted. He not only solved the problem quickly and correctly, but then proceeded to demonstrate 3 different methods for arriving at the same answer, explaining each approach with a clarity that impressed even Mr. Burton. The other boys fell silent, and Arthur, faced with such an obvious display of intellectual superiority, seemed to deflate like a punctured bladder. From that day forward, their relationship changed from one of predator and prey to something more like mutual avoidance, which suited Isaac perfectly well. As Isaac progressed through his studies at Skillington, it became increasingly clear that his abilities far exceeded what the small village school could nurture. Mr. Burton, recognizing exceptional talent when he saw it, began to provide Isaac with additional challenges and advanced materials. He lent the boy books from his own library, works on mathematics, natural philosophy, and classical literature that were far beyond the usual curriculum for children Isaac's age. Isaac devoured these texts with an appetite that amazed his teacher, often returning books within days and asking sophisticated questions that demonstrated not only comprehension but genuine analytical thinking. One of the books that particularly captured Isaac's imagination was a treatise on mechanical devices and simple machines. The author discussed levers, pulleys, gears, and other mechanisms in terms that Isaac found fascinating, and he began to see these principles at work everywhere in his daily life. The well at Woolsthorpe used a system of pulleys to raise the heavy bucket from its depths, and Isaac spent considerable time studying how the mechanical advantage was achieved. He experimented with building his own simple machines from scraps of wood and metal, creating devices that could lift weights far heavier than his own strength should have allowed. The manor house itself became Isaac's first laboratory, though his grandmother sometimes despaired of the odd contraptions that appeared in various corners of the building. Isaac fashioned a water clock by allowing drops to fall at a steady rate into a series of graduated containers, then carefully calibrated the device by comparing its measurements with the mechanical clock on the mantelpiece. He built a sundial in the garden, carefully calculating the angles needed to ensure accuracy throughout the changing seasons. When he discovered that different materials expanded and contracted at different rates when heated or cooled, he constructed a thermometer of sorts using a glass tube partially filled with colored water, though his understanding of the principles involved was still largely intuitive rather than theoretical. These early experiments taught Isaac important lessons about the relationship between theory and practice, and about the necessity of careful observation and measurement in understanding natural phenomena. When his water clock gained or lost time compared to the mechanical timepiece, he would disassemble the device and modify its design until the two instruments agreed more closely. When his sundial showed different times depending on the season, he researched the reasons behind this variation and adjusted his calculations accordingly. These were not the casual hobbies of a child, but the systematic investigations of a born scientist, though Isaac himself probably did not yet understand the significance of what he was doing. As word of Isaac's exceptional abilities spread through the small network of educated people in the district, it eventually reached the ears of his uncle William Ayscough, who was himself a graduate of Cambridge University. William had established himself as a successful clergyman and maintained connections with the academic world that his rural neighbours could only imagine. When he visited Woolsthorpe to see his nephew for himself, he was astounded by what he found. Here was a 12-year-old boy who could discuss mathematical concepts that would challenge university students, who had built working mechanical devices from basic materials, and who approached every question with a methodical rigor that impressed even learned men. William recognized immediately that Isaac's talents were being wasted in the small village school. No matter how dedicated Mr. Burton might be, he began to lobby Hannah, who was still living in North Witham with her second husband, to consider sending Isaac away for a more advanced education. The nearest institution that could provide the level of instruction Isaac needed was the King's School in Grantham, about 7 miles from Woolsthorpe. This was a respected grammar school with a reputation for preparing boys for university study, and several of its graduates had gone on to distinguished careers in the church, law, and other learned professions. The decision to send Isaac to the King's School was not made lightly, as it would require considerable financial sacrifice from the family, and would mean that the boy would need to board away from home during the school term. Hannah and Barnabas Smith discussed the matter at length, weighing the costs against the potential benefits for Isaac's future. Barnabas, to his credit, proved generous in his support for his stepson's education, agreeing to provide the necessary funds for tuition, room, and board. Marjorie Ayscough, though she would miss her grandson terribly, recognized that this opportunity was too valuable to decline. And so, in the autumn of 1655, when Isaac was approaching his 13th birthday, arrangements were made for him to begin his studies at the King's School in Grantham. The school had been founded in 1528 during the reign of Henry VIII, and its ancient buildings carried the weight of centuries of learning and tradition. The main schoolroom was a long, narrow hall, with high windows that cast diagonal beams of light across rows of wooden benches, worn smooth by generations of students. At one end stood the master's desk on a raised platform, from which the head teacher could survey his domain and ensure that proper discipline was maintained throughout the long hours of instruction. Isaac's arrival at the King's School marked the beginning of a new phase in his education and development, though the transition was not without its challenges. The curriculum was based heavily on classical languages and literature. Latin and Greek formed the core of instruction, with students expected to achieve fluency in both languages and familiarity with the great works of ancient authors. Mathematics was taught as well, but primarily as it related to practical applications in commerce and surveying, rather than as an abstract science worthy of study for its own sake. For a boy who had grown up in the relative freedom of rural Woolsthorpe, the rigid structure and formal atmosphere of the grammar school came as something of a shock. Students were expected to rise at dawn for morning prayers, attend classes throughout the day with only brief intervals for meals, and spend their evenings in supervised study until it was time for bed. Talking during lessons was forbidden, and infractions of the rules were punished swiftly and sometimes severely. The master, Dr. Henry Stokes, was a learned and generally fair man, but he maintained the sort of stern discipline that was considered essential for proper education in those days. Isaac found lodging with the family of Mr. William Clark, the local apothecary, whose house stood in the heart of Grantham's Market Square. The Clark household was a bustling place, filled with the exotic scents of the herbs, spices, and chemical preparations that formed the stock of Mr. Clark's trade. Isaac was given a small room in the attic, simply furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a chest for his belongings. The window looked out over the market square, and Isaac would often spend his free time watching the constant parade of merchants, farmers, and townsfolk who conducted their business in the cobblestone courtyard below. The apothecary's shop on the ground floor of the Clark house became a source of endless fascination for Isaac. Mr. Clark was a learned man in his own right, with knowledge of chemistry and medicine that extended far beyond the simple remedies that formed the bulk of his daily trade. His shop was lined with shelves of ceramic jars and glass bottles, each labelled in careful script with names that seemed to Isaac like incantations from some ancient magical tradition: aqua vitae, sal ammoniac, floris sulphuris, and dozens of others whose purposes he could only guess at. The air was always filled with a complex mixture of aromas, some pleasant like dried lavender or rose petals, others sharp and medicinal, and still others that spoke of mysterious processes involving fire and transformation. Isaac's naturally curious nature and his methodical approach to understanding the world around him made him an ideal student of the apothecary's art. Though Mr. Clark was initially hesitant to allow a young boy too close to substances that could be dangerous if mishandled. However, Isaac's obvious intelligence and his careful, respectful manner soon won the older man's confidence, and before long Isaac was being allowed to observe and even assist with some of the simpler preparations. He learned to grind herbs with mortar and pestle, achieving the fine uniform powders that were essential for effective medicines. He watched Mr. Clark distill essential oils from flower petals and aromatic leaves, marveling at how heat could separate the volatile essences from the solid plant matter, leaving behind pure concentrated fragrances that seemed to capture the very soul of the original flowers. These early experiences with chemical processes planted seeds in Isaac's mind that would later bloom into a deep interest in alchemy and the fundamental nature of matter itself. He began to understand that the world was far more complex and mutable than it appeared on the surface, that substances could be transformed in remarkable ways through the application of heat, pressure, and the careful combination of different materials. When Mr. Clark showed him how certain metals could be dissolved in acids and then recovered through precipitation, Isaac watched with the same intense attention he had once given to the mechanical workings of clocks and pulleys. Here was another aspect of natural philosophy that operated according to consistent laws, though these laws were far more subtle and mysterious than the simple mechanics of levers and gears. The months passed pleasantly enough in this routine of school during the day, and quiet study in his attic room during the evenings, with occasional forays into the fascinating world of the apothecary shop, when Mr. Clark had time to indulge his young lodger's curiosity. Isaac's academic performance at the King's School was, as might be expected, exemplary, though his approach to his studies sometimes puzzled his teachers. Where other students were content to memorize Latin vocabulary and grammatical rules, Isaac seemed compelled to understand the underlying logic of the language, to see how its various elements fit together in systematic ways. He would spend hours parsing complex sentences, not simply to complete his assignments but to discover the patterns and principles that governed Latin syntax. His mathematical abilities continued to develop rapidly, often outpacing what Dr. Stokes could provide in the way of instruction. Isaac had long since mastered the basic operations of arithmetic and had moved on to geometry, where his natural spatial intelligence found full expression. He could visualize complex three-dimensional shapes in his mind, mentally rotating them and examining them from different angles with an ease that amazed his teachers. When presented with geometric proofs, he would often discover alternative methods of demonstration that were more elegant than those found in the standard textbooks, though he was usually too modest to volunteer these improvements unless specifically asked. It was during this period at Grantham that Isaac first began to display the mechanical ingenuity that would characterize his approach to scientific investigation throughout his life. The Clark household possessed various timepieces, including a tall case clock in the front hall that chimed the hours with musical precision. Isaac became fascinated with the intricate clockwork mechanism that drove this instrument, and with Mr. Clark's permission, he carefully disassembled and examined every component. The brass gears, steel springs, and precisely machined escapement represented a level of craftsmanship that Isaac found both beautiful and intellectually satisfying. Here was a device that embodied mathematical principles in physical form, where abstract concepts of ratio, proportion, and periodic motion were translated into tangible working reality. Not content merely to understand how the clock functioned, Isaac set about building timepieces of his own design, working with simple materials, scraps of wood, bits of metal salvaged from broken tools, and pieces of string or wire. He constructed clocks that, while lacking the refined finish of professional instruments, nonetheless kept remarkably accurate time. His water clocks became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating multiple chambers and graduated scales that allowed for precise measurement of elapsed time. He built sundials not just for his own use, but for other members of the Clark household, carefully calculating the angles and proportions needed to ensure accuracy at Grantham's specific latitude. But perhaps Isaac's most impressive creation during this period was a working model of a windmill that he constructed entirely from memory. After observing a full-sized mill being built on the outskirts of town, the original mill was a substantial structure designed by a master millwright who had traveled from Holland to oversee its construction. Isaac would walk out to the construction site whenever his school schedule permitted. Watching with fascination as the complex mechanism took shape, he observed how the great wooden gears meshed together to transfer power from the rotating sails to the grinding stones, how the miller could adjust the angle of the sails to catch the wind most effectively, and how various safety mechanisms prevented damage when the wind became too strong. Isaac's model windmill, though built to perhaps 1/20th the scale of the original, incorporated all of these features in remarkable detail. The sails were fashioned from cloth and positioned at precisely the correct angles. The gears, carved from hardwood with patient precision, meshed smoothly and transferred power efficiently from the wind-driven mechanism to the grinding apparatus. Isaac even included a small supply of grain, wheat kernels borrowed from his grandmother's stores, and demonstrated that his model could actually produce a fine flour, though admittedly in quantities measured in pinches rather than pounds. Word of Isaac's mechanical prowess spread through Grantham's small community, and before long he was receiving requests to build similar devices for other families. Some wanted sundials for their gardens, others requested weather vanes or simple mechanical toys for their children. Isaac approached each commission with the same methodical care he brought to his academic studies, first making careful drawings and calculations, then constructing prototypes to test his designs, and finally building the finished products with painstaking attention to detail. These projects provided him with valuable practical experience in working with wood and metal, skills that would serve him well in later years when he needed to construct scientific instruments for his research. The income from these small commissions was modest but welcome, as it allowed Isaac to purchase materials for his own projects, and occasionally to buy books that caught his interest in the shops of Grantham. The town possessed several booksellers who catered to the needs of the grammar school and the surrounding community of educated clergy and professional men. Isaac became a familiar figure in these establishments, carefully examining volumes on mathematics, natural philosophy, and mechanical arts before making his purchases. The shopkeepers learned to trust his judgment, and would sometimes set aside books that they thought might interest him, knowing that Isaac was one of the few customers who would actually read and appreciate advanced technical works. One book that particularly captured Isaac's imagination during this period was John Bates' The Mysteries of Nature and Art, a comprehensive treatise on mechanical devices, scientific instruments, and what we might today call engineering principles. Bates' work contained detailed descriptions and illustrations of everything from simple pulleys and levers to complex clockwork mechanisms and optical devices. Isaac studied this book with the devotion that a theologian might bring to scripture, memorizing entire passages and working through every problem and example that Bates provided. More importantly, he began to extend and improve upon Bates' designs, applying his own growing understanding of mathematical principles to create more efficient and elegant solutions. As Isaac's final year at the King's School approached, the question of his future became increasingly pressing. Dr. Stokes had made it clear to Isaac's family that the boy's abilities warranted university study, and there was really only one institution in England that could provide the advanced education he needed: Cambridge University. The University of Oxford, while prestigious, was still dominated by conservative religious thinking and offered little in the way of mathematical or scientific instruction. Cambridge, on the other hand, had begun to embrace the new learning that was sweeping across Europe, and its mathematics faculty included some of the finest scholars in England. The prospect of sending Isaac to Cambridge presented significant financial challenges for the family, as university education was expensive and could easily consume several years of a working man's income. Hannah and Barnabas Smith discussed the matter at length, weighing the costs against the potential benefits for Isaac's future career prospects. In those days, a Cambridge education typically led to a position in the church, the law, or perhaps government service, all respectable professions that could provide a comfortable living for a man of learning. There was also the possibility that Isaac might eventually return to Cambridge as a fellow and spend his life in academic pursuits, though this path was usually reserved for men of exceptional ability and dedication. The decision was complicated by practical considerations as well as financial ones. Barnabas Smith was growing older and less able to manage the agricultural operations that provided most of the family's income. There was some pressure on Isaac to abandon his academic ambitions and return to Woolsthorpe to take over the management of the family estate. After all, he was now the male heir to the Newton property, and farming, while perhaps not as intellectually stimulating as mathematics, was a reliable source of livelihood that had sustained his family for generations. Isaac himself felt torn between these competing demands. On one hand, his love of learning and his growing awareness of his own exceptional abilities made the prospect of university study almost irresistibly attractive. On the other hand, he was acutely conscious of the financial burden that his education would place on his family, and he felt a strong sense of duty to his mother and grandmother, who had sacrificed so much for his benefit. The decision was made more difficult by his natural tendency toward introspection and his reluctance to assert his own desires when they might conflict with family obligations. The matter was finally decided by an unexpected intervention from Dr. Stokes, who took the unusual step of writing directly to Hannah to express his views on Isaac's future. In his letter, the schoolmaster described Isaac as the most promising student he had encountered in many years of teaching, possessing not only exceptional intellectual abilities, but also the dedication and character necessary for serious scholarly work. Dr. Stokes argued that it would be a tragedy for such talents to be wasted in agricultural pursuits, and he offered to use his own connections at Cambridge to help secure Isaac's admission and to find sources of financial support that might make his education more affordable. This letter had a profound effect on Hannah, who had always harbored ambitions for her son that extended beyond the rural life she had known. She began to see Isaac's university education not as a luxury but as an investment in his future, and by extension in the future prosperity of the entire family. A man with a Cambridge degree could aspire to positions of influence and authority that would be forever closed to even the most successful farmer. The risks involved in pursuing such a path were considerable, but so were the potential rewards. And so, in the spring of 1661, when Isaac was 18 years old, the final preparations began for his departure to Cambridge. The process of gaining admission to the university was less formal in those days than it would later become, but it still required letters of recommendation, evidence of academic preparation, and most importantly, the financial resources necessary to support several years of study. Dr. Stokes provided the necessary testimonials to Isaac's character and abilities, while Uncle William Iscuff used his connections among the Cambridge clergy to identify potential sources of support and guidance. The ancient University of Cambridge in 1661 was a collection of independent colleges, each with its own traditions, regulations, and financial arrangements. Trinity College, founded by Henry VIII in 1546, was the largest and most prestigious of these institutions, with magnificent buildings and a reputation for attracting the sons of nobility and wealthy merchants. But Isaac's more modest circumstances pointed toward one of the smaller colleges, where the fees might be more manageable, and where there were often opportunities for bright young men to earn their way through university by performing various services for their wealthier fellow students. Trinity College ultimately proved to be Isaac's destination, though not in the capacity that his intellectual achievements might have suggested. He was admitted as a subsizor, which meant that he would pay reduced fees in exchange for performing menial tasks such as serving meals to fellow students, cleaning their rooms, and running various errands. This arrangement was not uncommon for young men of modest means who possessed the academic qualifications for university study but lacked the financial resources to attend as full-paying students. While the work was sometimes demeaning and the social distinctions it created could be painful, the subsizor system did make it possible for talented individuals to gain access to one of the finest educational institutions in Europe. The journey from Grantham to Cambridge in June of 1661 marked a turning point in Isaac's life that was both exciting and terrifying. He travelled by stagecoach, his few belongings packed into a single trunk that contained his clothes, books, and some of the mechanical devices he had built during his years at the King's School. The countryside through which the coach passed was lush and green in the early summer warmth, with fields of ripening grain that stretched to the horizon under a sky filled with billowing white clouds that cast ever-changing shadows across the landscape. As the spires and towers of Cambridge came into view in the distance, Isaac must have felt something of what a pilgrim experiences upon first glimpsing his destination after a long and arduous journey. Here was the seat of learning that had produced some of the greatest minds in English history, the place where scholars had wrestled with the deepest questions of philosophy, theology, mathematics, and natural science for centuries past. The very stones of the ancient buildings seemed to whisper of the accumulated wisdom of generations, and the air itself felt charged with intellectual possibility. Trinity College, when Isaac first set foot in its great court, was an overwhelming mixture of grandeur and antiquity that spoke of power, tradition, and serious purpose. The court itself was the largest of any Cambridge college, surrounded by buildings of honey-coloured limestone that had weathered centuries of English seasons. The chapel, with its soaring Gothic architecture and magnificent stained glass windows, dominated one side of the court, while the Master's Lodge and the Great Hall occupied positions of corresponding importance. Students in their black gowns moved across the cobblestones with the confident bearing of young men who knew themselves to be part of an elite institution, their voices echoing off the ancient walls as they discussed their studies or planned their recreational activities. Isaac's own quarters were far more modest than the grand public spaces of the college, but they represented a significant step forward from his simple attic room in Grantham. He was assigned a small chamber in one of the older buildings, furnished with basic necessities: a narrow bed, a writing desk, a chair, and shelves for his books and personal belongings. The room was cold in winter and warm in summer, with a single small window that provided just enough light for reading and writing, but it was his own space, a sanctuary where he could pursue his studies without interruption, and Isaac appreciated this privacy more than any luxury. The daily routine at Trinity College was structured around the traditional practices that had governed university life for centuries. The day began before dawn with chapel services where all members of the college were expected to attend morning prayers, regardless of their personal religious inclinations. Breakfast followed, usually consisting of bread, butter, and small beer, consumed in the Great Hall under the watchful eyes of portraits of distinguished alumni and benefactors. The morning hours were devoted to formal lectures and tutorials, where students worked through the prescribed curriculum under the guidance of senior members of the college. Isaac's status as a subzoser meant that his academic schedule was interrupted by various service duties that his wealthier fellow students were spared. He might spend part of his morning serving breakfast to the paying students, ensuring that their tables were properly set and that they had everything they needed for their meal. Later in the day, he might be called upon to clean rooms, carry messages, or assist with the preparation of the evening meal. These tasks were time-consuming and sometimes exhausting, but they also provided Isaac with opportunities to observe the social dynamics of college life from a unique perspective. The curriculum at Cambridge in the 1660s was still heavily based on medieval traditions, with most instruction conducted in Latin and focused on classical authors, Aristotelian philosophy, and traditional religious texts. Mathematics was taught, but usually only as it related to practical applications or as preparation for more advanced study in natural philosophy. For a mind like Isaac's, which had already explored many areas of mathematics far beyond what most university students ever encountered, much of the formal instruction must have seemed elementary and occasionally tedious. But Cambridge offered resources that Isaac had never enjoyed before, most notably access to one of the finest libraries in England. The college library contained thousands of volumes covering every branch of learning known to the European intellectual tradition, from ancient Greek and Roman classics to the latest works on mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Isaac soon became a familiar figure in the library, arriving early in the morning and often remaining until the last possible moment before the doors were locked for the night. He read voraciously and systematically, working his way through treatises on geometry, optics, mechanics, and the emerging science that would later be called physics. It was during his early years at Cambridge that Isaac first encountered the works of René Descartes, the brilliant French philosopher and mathematician whose revolutionary ideas were reshaping European thought. Descartes had proposed a new approach to understanding the natural world, one based on mathematical analysis and systematic doubt rather than unquestioning acceptance of ancient authorities. His discourse on method and principles of philosophy introduced Isaac to ways of thinking that were radically different from the Aristotelian philosophy that still dominated the official Cambridge curriculum. Descartes' mathematical innovations were particularly exciting to Isaac, who had already begun to chafe against the limitations of traditional geometric methods. The Cartesian coordinate system, which allowed geometric problems to be solved using algebraic techniques, opened up entirely new possibilities for mathematical investigation. Isaac threw himself into mastering these methods, working through problem after problem until he had gained complete fluency in analytical geometry. More importantly, he began to see how mathematical analysis might be applied to physical problems, using algebraic equations to describe the motions of celestial bodies or the behavior of mechanical systems. But Isaac's intellectual development during his Cambridge years was not limited to his private reading and study. He also began to establish relationships with some of the more progressive members of the faculty, men who shared his interest in the new experimental approach to natural philosophy that was beginning to gain acceptance throughout Europe. One of the most important of these mentors was Dr. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics, who had already achieved considerable reputation for his work in geometry and optics. Dr. Barrow was a remarkable figure, combining profound mathematical ability with broad interests in theology, classical literature, and what we might today call experimental science. He had traveled extensively on the continent, studying with leading scholars in Paris, Florence, and other centers of learning, and he had returned to Cambridge with a deep appreciation for the new methods of investigation that were revolutionizing European science. Unlike many of his colleagues who remained wedded to traditional approaches based on textual authority and logical disputation, Barrow believed that true understanding of the natural world could only come through careful observation, mathematical analysis, and controlled experimentation. Under Barrow's guidance, Isaac began to develop the habits of mind and methods of investigation that would characterize his mature scientific work. He learned to approach each problem with careful attention to underlying assumptions, to gather data systematically, and to test theoretical predictions against experimental results. More fundamentally, he began to understand that mathematics was not simply an abstract exercise but a powerful tool for understanding and predicting natural phenomena. The same geometric principles that govern the construction of sundials and mechanical clocks could also explain the motions of the planets and the behavior of light rays passing through optical lenses. The intellectual ferment of Cambridge in the 1660s provided Isaac with exposure to ideas and methods that would have been impossible to encounter in the rural environment of his childhood. The university was beginning to serve as a meeting place for men interested in what they called experimental philosophy, and Isaac was able to attend informal discussions where the latest discoveries and theories were debated with passion and precision. He heard reports of the astronomical observations being made by Giovanni Cassini in Paris, of Robert Hooke's microscopic investigations in London, and of the mathematical work being done by scholars throughout Europe. But perhaps the most important intellectual influence on Isaac during this period came not from his teachers or fellow students, but from his own systematic reading of the most advanced mathematical and scientific works of his time. He studied the writings of Galileo Galilei, whose observations with the newly invented telescope had revolutionized astronomy, and whose mathematical analysis of motion had laid the foundations for what would later become the science of mechanics. He worked through the optical treatises of Johannes Kepler, learning how mathematical laws could describe the behavior of light rays and explain the operation of telescopes and other optical instruments. Most significantly, Isaac encountered the mathematical work of John Wallis, Pierre de Fermat, and other scholars who were pushing the boundaries of algebraic and geometric analysis, far beyond anything that had been possible with traditional methods. These mathematicians had developed new techniques for handling infinite series, for calculating areas and volumes of complex shapes, and for analyzing curves and surfaces of arbitrary complexity. Isaac not only mastered these advanced methods but began to extend and generalize them, developing approaches that would eventually mature into the mathematical system we now call calculus. The years 1664 and 1665 were particularly fruitful for Isaac's mathematical development, as he worked with increasing confidence and originality on problems that had puzzled scholars for centuries. His notebooks from this period, written in the careful script that had become second nature during his years of intensive study, reveal a mind grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of space, time, motion, and mathematical infinity. These were not merely academic exercises, but genuine investigations into the deepest principles that govern our physical universe, though Isaac himself may not yet have fully grasped the revolutionary implications of his work. But this period of intense intellectual growth was suddenly interrupted by events far beyond the walls of Cambridge University. In the spring of 1665, reports began to reach England of a terrible plague that was sweeping through the cities of continental Europe. leaving death and devastation in its wake. The disease, which would come to be known as the Great Plague of London, was the same bubonic plague that had periodically ravaged European populations for centuries, spread by fleas that lived on rats and other rodents. When it reached the densely populated neighbourhoods of London in June of 1665, it spread with terrifying speed, killing thousands of people within a matter of weeks. The authorities at Cambridge, recognising the mortal danger that such an epidemic posed to any community where large numbers of people lived in close proximity, made the difficult decision to suspend normal university operations and send the students home until the danger had passed. This was not an unprecedented action. Universities had closed during previous plague outbreaks, but it still came as a shock to students and faculty who had been absorbed in their academic pursuits. The announcement was made in late June, and within days the colleges were emptying as young men packed their belongings and made arrangements to return to their family homes scattered across England. For Isaac, now 22 years old and just beginning to hit his intellectual stride, this forced interruption of his Cambridge studies might have seemed like a devastating setback. He had been making remarkable progress in his mathematical investigations, had developed close working relationships with mentors like Dr. Barrow, and had access to library resources that were unmatched anywhere in England. The prospect of returning to the rural isolation of Woolsthorpe, with its lack of scholarly companionship and limited intellectual resources, could hardly have been appealing to a young man whose mind was fully engaged with the most advanced problems of mathematical and natural philosophy. But as events would prove, this enforced retreat to the Lincolnshire countryside would become one of the most productive periods in the entire history of human intellectual achievement. Free from the distractions of university life, the social obligations of college membership, and the prescribed curriculum that still dominated Cambridge education, Isaac found himself with unlimited time and mental energy to pursue his own investigations wherever they might lead. The quiet rural environment that had once seemed limiting now became the perfect laboratory for a mind that worked best in solitude and silence. Isaac arrived back at Woolsthorpe Manor in the summer of 1665 to find the familiar landscape largely unchanged from his childhood memories. The same ancient oak tree still dominated the front yard, its massive trunk scarred by decades of wind and weather, but its branches still spreading wide to provide cool shade during the warm summer months. The apple orchard behind the house was heavy with fruit that would soon be ready for harvest, the trees bending under the weight of apples that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. His grandmother, now quite elderly but still alert and welcoming, was delighted to have her scholarly grandson home again, though she worried about the plague that had driven him away from his studies. The manor house itself had changed little during Isaac's years at Cambridge, though his mother Hannah and stepfather Barnabas had made some improvements to the property during their periodic visits. The great room where Isaac had spent so many childhood hours still centered around the massive stone fireplace, though the mechanical clock on the mantelpiece had been replaced by a more modern timepiece that kept more accurate time. Isaac's old room in the upper part of the house had been maintained much as he had left it, with the same simple furniture and the same small window that looked out over the rolling fields and meadows that stretched toward the horizon. But Isaac himself had changed dramatically during his years at university, and he now saw his childhood home through very different eyes. Where once he had been content to build simple mechanical devices and conduct elementary experiments with water clocks and sundials, he now possessed the mathematical tools and theoretical understanding necessary to investigate far more fundamental questions about the nature of physical reality. The familiar objects and phenomena of rural life, falling apples, flowing streams, the daily motion of the sun across the sky, now appeared to him as manifestations of universal principles that might be understood through careful analysis and mathematical description. The enforced solitude of his plague years suited Isaac's temperament perfectly, allowing him to work for hours without interruption, following his thoughts wherever they might lead without concern for academic schedules or social expectations. He established a daily routine that maximized his productive thinking time, rising early to take advantage of the quiet morning hours when his mind was freshest, working steadily through the day on whatever problem currently occupied his attention, and often continuing his investigations late into the evening by candlelight when particularly interesting results seemed within reach. His first major breakthrough during this period came in his work on what mathematicians now call the method of fluxions. Though Isaac himself used different terminology to describe his discoveries, he had been struggling with problems involving the calculation of tangent lines to curves, areas bounded by complex shapes, and the rates at which various quantities change with respect to time or other variables. These were problems that had challenged the greatest mathematicians of previous generations, and the traditional geometric methods inherited from ancient Greek mathematics seemed inadequate to handle them in full generality. Working in the quiet of his room at Woolsthorpe, with mathematical books scattered across his desk and sheets of paper covered with calculations and diagrams, Isaac began to develop a systematic method for handling such problems. He realized that many apparently different mathematical questions could be understood as aspects of a single, more general problem involving the relationship between a function and its rate of change. By developing rules for manipulating these relationships algebraically, he could solve problems that had previously required elaborate geometric constructions or case-by-case analysis. The mathematical technique that emerged from these investigations was revolutionary in its power and generality, though Isaac initially kept his discoveries largely to himself, sharing them only occasionally with his mentor Dr. Burrow and a few other trusted correspondents. What he had created was essentially a complete system of differential and integral calculus, though it would be many years before these methods were published and became widely known to the mathematical community. The implications of this work extended far beyond pure mathematics, as Isaac soon discovered when he began to apply his new methods to problems in physics and astronomy. During the long summer days of 1665, Isaac would often take his mathematical work outside, spreading his papers on a simple wooden table beneath the great oak tree, where the dappled shade provided relief from the heat, while still allowing sufficient light for reading and writing. It was here, according to a story that Isaac himself would tell in later years, that he witnessed an event that sparked one of his most famous insights into the nature of gravity and celestial motion. An apple fell from one of the nearby trees in the orchard, its descent caught by Isaac's peripheral vision as he worked on a particularly challenging calculation. Now, apples had been falling from trees since the beginning of time, and Isaac had certainly seen countless such events during his childhood at Woolsthorpe, but on this particular occasion, his mind was primed by years of mathematical training and months of intensive work on problems involving motion and force to see something more significant in this simple natural phenomenon. As he watched the apple fall, accelerating as it approached the ground, Isaac began to wonder what force was responsible for this motion, and whether the same force that pulled the apple toward the Earth might also be responsible for keeping the moon in its orbit around our planet. This was a profound and revolutionary idea, though Isaac would need several more years of mathematical development before he could work out its full implications. Previous thinkers had assumed that terrestrial and celestial phenomena were governed by completely different sets of natural laws, that objects on Earth fell because they sought their natural place, while celestial bodies moved in perfect circles because that was the most perfect form of motion. Isaac's insight was to recognize that these apparently different phenomena might be manifestations of a single, universal force that operated according to consistent mathematical principles throughout the entire cosmos. During the autumn months of 1665, as the Lincolnshire countryside transformed itself into a tapestry of gold and crimson, Isaac continued to develop his ideas about motion and gravitation, while also pursuing investigations in other areas of natural philosophy. He had become particularly interested in the nature of light and color, phenomena that had puzzled scholars for centuries and that seemed to offer promising opportunities for experimental investigation. Unlike his work in mathematics, which could be pursued using only paper, pen, and the resources of his own mind, optical investigations required specialized equipment and careful experimental design. Working with limited resources but unlimited ingenuity, Isaac began to construct his own optical instruments using materials he could obtain in the rural environment of Woolsthorpe. He ground his own lenses from pieces of glass, learning through trial and error to achieve the precise curves and smooth surfaces necessary for optical experiments. He built prisms by carefully shaping pieces of clear glass into triangular cross-sections, then polishing the surfaces until they were perfectly transparent. These simple devices, created with tools hardly more sophisticated than those available to medieval craftsmen, would soon enable discoveries that revolutionized human understanding of the nature of light itself. Isaac's first major optical discovery came when he used one of his homemade prisms to examine a beam of sunlight streaming through a small hole in his window shutter. Previous investigators had observed that sunlight passing through a prism produced a spectrum of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, but they had generally assumed that the prism somehow modified or contaminated the originally pure white light, adding colors that were not inherently present in the solar radiation. This interpretation seemed reasonable because it fitted with the ancient Greek theory that white light was the purest and most fundamental form of illumination, with colors representing various degrees of corruption or mixture. But Isaac approached this phenomenon with the systematic skepticism that had become characteristic of his investigative method. Rather than accepting the traditional explanation, he designed a series of careful experiments to test whether the colors were truly being added by the prism, or whether they might already be present in the original sunlight. He found that when he used a second prism to recombine the separated colors, he could reproduce the original white light, suggesting that white light was actually a mixture of all the spectral colors rather than a pure substance that was being contaminated by the prism. Even more significantly, Isaac discovered that each individual color was refracted by a different amount when passing through the prism, with red light being bent the least and violet light being bent the most. This meant that white light could be understood as a mixture of rays with different intrinsic properties, each following its own precise mathematical laws when interacting with transparent materials. This was a revolutionary insight that contradicted centuries of accepted theory and opened up entirely new possibilities for understanding optical phenomena. The implications of these discoveries extended far beyond the immediate questions about the nature of light and color. Isaac realized that the different refractive properties of different colors explained why telescopes of his day produced images with colored fringes around bright objects, a problem known as chromatic aberration that severely limited the effectiveness of refracting telescopes. If white light consisted of components that were refracted by different amounts, then any lens system would inevitably focus different colors at slightly different points, producing the blurred, rainbow-edged images that plagued contemporary astronomers. This understanding led Isaac to consider whether it might be possible to construct telescopes that avoided this problem entirely, perhaps by using mirrors instead of lenses to focus light. Mirrors, he reasoned, would reflect all colors equally, without the differential refraction that caused chromatic aberration in lens-based instruments. Working in a small outbuilding behind the manor house that he converted into a makeshift workshop, Isaac began to experiment with curved mirrors made from polished metal, learning to shape and polish speculum metal alloys until they could reflect light with remarkable precision. The reflecting telescope that emerged from these experiments was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity and optical precision, especially considering the primitive tools and materials with which Isaac was working. The primary mirror, only about 2 inches in diameter but perfectly parabolic in shape, was mounted in a wooden tube along with a smaller flat mirror that directed the focused light to an eyepiece positioned at the side of the instrument. The entire device was only about 8 inches long, making it far more compact than refracting telescopes of equivalent power, yet it produced images that were notably sharper and clearer than anything available from contemporary instruments. When Isaac eventually demonstrated his reflecting telescope to members of the Royal Society in London, it caused an immediate sensation. Here was a device that not only solved the chromatic aberration problems that had limited all previous telescopes, but did so using principles that no one else had thought to apply to astronomical instrumentation. The telescope represented a perfect combination of theoretical understanding and practical craftsmanship, demonstrating Isaac's unique ability to move seamlessly between abstract mathematical analysis and concrete experimental investigation. But the reflecting telescope was only one manifestation of the remarkable intellectual productivity that characterized Isaac's plague years at Woolsthorpe. During the same period, he was also making fundamental contributions to pure mathematics, developing the methods that would later be known as the calculus, and laying the groundwork for his theories of mechanics and universal gravitation. It was as if his enforced isolation had concentrated his mental energies and allowed him to pursue multiple lines of investigation simultaneously, each informing and enriching the others in ways that would have been impossible under more normal circumstances. The winter of 1665-1666 was particularly harsh in Lincolnshire, with heavy snows that isolated the manor house for weeks at a time, and temperatures so low that ink would freeze in its bottle if Isaac's room were not kept constantly warmed by a small fire. But these conditions only served to enhance the solitude and concentration that Isaac found so conducive to creative thinking. He would work for hours by candlelight, his mathematical calculations and experimental notes scattered across his desk, while the wind howled around the ancient stones of the manor house and snow piled high against the diamond-paned windows. It was during these long winter nights that Isaac made some of his most profound insights into the mathematical description of motion and change, building on his earlier work with what he called the method of fluxions. He began to develop a comprehensive theory of mechanics that could describe the motion of any object under the influence of any set of forces. This was an enormously ambitious project that required him to think carefully about fundamental concepts like space, time, mass, and acceleration that had been taken for granted by previous generations of natural philosophers. Isaac's approach to these problems was characteristically systematic and mathematical. Rather than relying on qualitative descriptions or appeals to common sense, he sought to express the relationships between different physical quantities in precise algebraic terms that would allow for exact calculations and predictions. He realized that acceleration, the rate at which velocity changes, was the key concept that linked forces to motion, and he began to formulate what would eventually become known as Newton's laws of motion. The first law stated that objects in motion tend to remain in motion, and objects at rest tend to remain at rest, unless acted upon by external forces. This principle of inertia directly contradicted the Aristotelian physics that still dominated university curricula, which held that objects naturally came to rest, and that continuous force was required to maintain motion. Isaac's formulation recognized that motion itself was a natural state that required no explanation, while changes in motion were what needed to be accounted for through the action of forces. The second law provided a quantitative relationship between force, mass, and acceleration, stating that the acceleration of an object is proportional to the net force acting on it and inversely proportional to its mass. This seemingly simple statement had profound implications for understanding mechanical systems, as it allowed precise calculations of how objects would move under any given set of conditions. Combined with his mathematical methods for handling rates of change, this law gave Isaac the tools necessary to solve problems that had been completely intractable using earlier approaches. The third law established that forces always occur in pairs, with every action producing an equal and opposite reaction. This principle helped to clarify the relationship between different objects in mechanical systems and provided important insights into phenomena ranging from the recoil of firearms to the motion of rockets and projectiles. More fundamentally, it suggested that the universe operated according to principles of balance and symmetry that could be expressed in elegant mathematical terms. As spring returned to Lincolnshire in 1666, Isaac began to apply these mechanical principles to the problem that had been suggested by his observation of the falling apple. Whether the force that caused objects to fall toward the Earth might be the same force that kept celestial bodies in their orbits. This question required him to combine his new understanding of mechanics with careful analysis of astronomical observations, particularly data about the motion of the Moon around the Earth. Working with the limited astronomical data available to him, Isaac attempted to calculate whether the acceleration of the Moon in its orbit could be accounted for by the same gravitational force that caused apples to fall. This was an enormously challenging problem that required precise knowledge of the Moon's distance from Earth, its orbital period, and the value of gravitational acceleration at the Earth's surface. Isaac's initial calculations gave results that were tantalizingly close to what his theory predicted, but not quite accurate enough to be fully convincing, possibly due to imprecise values for some of the astronomical constants he was using. Despite these preliminary difficulties, Isaac was convinced that he was on the right track, and he continued to refine his theory throughout 1666. He began to envision a universe in which the same mathematical laws governed both terrestrial and celestial phenomena, where the force that made an apple fall was fundamentally identical to the force that kept planets in their orbits around the Sun. This was a breathtakingly unified vision of physical reality that promised to replace the complex compartmentalized theories of previous generations with a single, elegant mathematical description of all mechanical phenomena. The summer of 1666 brought reports that the plague was beginning to subside in London and other major cities, raising the possibility that Cambridge University might soon reopen and normal academic life could resume. For Isaac, this prospect brought mixed feelings. On one hand, he was eager to return to the intellectual community of the university, to share his discoveries with mentors like Dr. Barrow, and to gain access once again to the remarkable library resources that had been so important to his earlier development. On the other hand, the solitude and freedom of Woolsthorpe had proven extraordinarily conducive to creative work, and he was reluctant to give up the unstructured time that had allowed him to pursue his investigations wherever they might lead. As he prepared for his eventual return to Cambridge, Isaac took stock of what he had accomplished during his enforced exile from university life. In less than 2 years, working essentially alone with minimal resources, he had made fundamental contributions to at least 3 major areas of human knowledge. His mathematical work had produced a systematic calculus that could handle problems involving rates of change and infinite processes with unprecedented power and generality. His optical investigations had revealed the composite nature of white light and had led to the invention of a new type of telescope that was superior to all existing instruments. His mechanical theories had laid the foundation for a unified understanding of motion and gravitation that promised to revolutionize physics and astronomy. Perhaps even more significantly, Isaac had developed a new approach to natural philosophy that combined mathematical analysis, experimental investigation, and theoretical synthesis in ways that would define the scientific method for centuries to come. Rather than relying on authority or purely logical reasoning, he had learned to test theoretical predictions against carefully designed experiments and precise observations. Rather than accepting qualitative descriptions as sufficient, he had insisted on quantitative mathematical relationships that could yield exact predictions. Rather than treating different phenomena as completely separate, he had sought underlying unifying principles that could explain apparently diverse effects in terms of a few fundamental laws. The young man who prepared to return to Cambridge in the spring of 1667 was very different from the promising but relatively conventional student who had left 2 years earlier. Isaac had transformed himself from a talented scholar into something approaching a scientific revolutionary. Though the full implications of his work would not become apparent for many years to come, he had experienced what can only be described as one of the most remarkable periods of individual intellectual achievement in human history, comparable to the greatest creative outbursts of artists, writers, or composers in any field of human endeavor. But Isaac himself was characteristically modest about his accomplishments, viewing them as natural extensions of the mathematical and experimental methods he had learned from his teachers and from his systematic reading of contemporary scientific literature. He was not yet fully aware that his work represented a fundamental break with previous approaches to natural philosophy, or that the ideas he had developed in the quiet solitude of Woolsthorpe Manor would eventually reshape humanity's understanding of the physical universe. For now, he was simply a young scholar eager to return to his studies and to continue the investigations that had proven so fascinating and rewarding during his plague years in the countryside. The return journey to Cambridge in the spring of 1667 must have been filled with anticipation and perhaps some anxiety about how his long absence would affect his standing within the university community. The landscape through which Isaac travelled was awakening from its long winter sleep, with fresh green leaves appearing on the trees and wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows and hedgerows. The same roads that had carried him away from his studies 2 years earlier now brought him back to resume his academic career, but he was no longer the same person who had made that earlier journey, and the work he had accomplished during his time away would soon begin to reshape the entire intellectual landscape of European science. As the familiar spires of Cambridge came into view, Isaac could hardly have imagined that the ideas he had developed in the solitude of Woolsthorpe would eventually earn him recognition as one of the greatest scientific minds in human history, or that the mathematical methods, optical discoveries, and mechanical theories he had worked out during his plague years would form the foundation for centuries of subsequent scientific progress. For now, he was simply relieved to be returning to the scholarly community, where he felt most at home, carrying with him a collection of notebooks and manuscripts that contained the seeds of a scientific revolution. The Cambridge that Isaac returned to in 1667 was subtly different from the institution he had left 2 years earlier. The plague had taken its toll not only in London, but throughout England, claiming the lives of several faculty members and students, and leaving the entire academic community more aware of life's fragility and uncertainty. There was a palpable sense of relief that normal activities could resume, but also a recognition that the enforced hiatus had interrupted important work and disrupted established routines in ways that would take time to fully remedy. Isaac settled back into his modest quarters at Trinity College with the quiet satisfaction of a scholar returning to his natural habitat. His room seemed smaller than he remembered, and the familiar sounds of college life, the chapel bells marking the canonical hours, the footsteps of students and fellows echoing in the stone corridors, the animated discussions that carried across the courtyards, took some time to readjust to after the profound silence of his years at Woolsthorpe. But there was also a comforting predictability to the academic routine that he had missed during his rural exile, and he was eager to reconnect with mentors and colleagues who shared his passion for learning and discovery. Dr. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, was particularly pleased to have his most promising student back at Cambridge, though he was unprepared for the dramatic intellectual transformation that Isaac had undergone during his time away. When Isaac began to share some of his mathematical discoveries from the plague years, Barrow realized that his former pupil had evolved into something approaching an equal, if not indeed a superior, in mathematical sophistication and insight. The methods that Isaac had developed for handling problems involving infinite series and rates of change represented advances that Barrow himself had been struggling with for years, and the elegant solutions that Isaac presented seemed to open up entirely new realms of mathematical possibility. The relationship between teacher and student began to shift subtly, as Isaac demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even Barrow's considerable expertise. Rather than feeling threatened by his pupil's remarkable progress, however, Barrow showed the generous spirit that characterized the finest scholars of his generation, encouraging Isaac to develop and publish his work while providing whatever support and guidance might be helpful. This mentorship would prove crucial in the coming years, as Isaac gradually gained the confidence necessary to share his discoveries with the broader intellectual community beyond Cambridge. One of the first areas where Isaac began to make his new knowledge known was in his optical investigations, which had the advantage of producing dramatic experimental demonstrations that could convince even the most skeptical observers. He constructed several improved versions of his reflecting telescope, each incorporating refinements suggested by his growing understanding of optical principles and his increasing skill in grinding and polishing curved mirrors. These instruments produced images of remarkable clarity and definition, allowing observers to see celestial details that had never before been visible through any telescope. Word of Isaac's optical innovations began to spread through the informal network of natural philosophers who corresponded regularly about scientific developments throughout Europe. Letters describing his reflecting telescope reached members of the Royal Society in London, the premier scientific organisation in England, whose members included some of the most distinguished scholars and experimenters of the age. The society had been founded just a few years earlier, in 1660, with the motto "Nullius in verba," take nobody's word for it, reflecting a commitment to experimental verification and empirical investigation that perfectly matched Isaac's own approach to natural philosophy. In 1671, when Isaac was 28 years old, Dr. Barrow arranged for one of Isaac's reflecting telescopes to be demonstrated before the Royal Society, where it created an immediate sensation. The instrument was barely 8 inches long, yet it magnified objects to the same degree as refracting telescopes that were 6 feet in length or more. Even more impressive was the clarity of the images it produced. Free from the chromatic aberration that plagued all lens-based instruments, the Fellows of the Society were so impressed that they unanimously elected Isaac to membership, an honor that was rarely bestowed on someone so young or with so little published work to his credit. This recognition by the Royal Society marked Isaac's emergence from the relative obscurity of university life into the broader world of European scientific culture. His election was particularly significant because the Society included not only English scholars but also maintained extensive correspondence with natural philosophers throughout the continent, from Paris to Florence to Amsterdam. Membership meant that Isaac's work would be communicated to scholars everywhere, subjected to critical scrutiny by the finest minds of the age, and integrated into the rapidly developing body of experimental and theoretical knowledge that was transforming European understanding of the natural world. But success brought new challenges as well as new opportunities. Isaac soon discovered that the world of scientific publication and scholarly controversy was far more complex and potentially treacherous than the quiet environment of Cambridge college life. When he submitted his first paper to the Royal Society in 1672, describing his discoveries about the nature of white light and the behaviour of colours when passed through prisms, the response was not the universal acceptance he had naively expected, but rather a storm of criticism and debate that would continue for years. The paper, which Isaac titled New Theory About Light and Colours, represented a fundamental challenge to accepted optical theory and therefore attracted opposition from scholars who had built their careers on the traditional understanding of these phenomena. Robert Hooke, one of the most prominent fellows of the Royal Society and a man of considerable experimental skill and theoretical insight, led the criticism of Isaac's work, arguing that the experimental results could be explained just as well by more conventional theories that did not require such radical revisions to established doctrine. The controversy that ensued was Isaac's first taste of the rough-and-tumble world of scientific debate, where ideas were subjected to merciless scrutiny and where personal reputations could be damaged by theoretical disagreements. Isaac found this environment deeply uncomfortable, preferring the certainty of mathematical demonstration to the endless arguments and counter-arguments that seemed to characterize discussions of experimental results. His natural inclination toward privacy and solitude was reinforced by these early experiences with scientific controversy, and he became increasingly reluctant to publish his work or to engage in public debates about natural philosophy. Despite these difficulties, Isaac's reputation continued to grow within the Cambridge community, where his mathematical abilities were becoming legendary among both students and faculty. Dr. Barrow, now in his 50s and beginning to think about his eventual retirement, was increasingly convinced that Isaac represented the future of mathematical science at Cambridge. In 1669, in a gesture that was as generous as it was unprecedented, Barrow resigned his Lucasian professorship and recommended that Isaac be appointed as his successor, even though Isaac was still only 26 years old and had published virtually nothing of his remarkable mathematical work. The appointment of someone so young to such a prestigious position raised eyebrows throughout the university, but Barrow's recommendation carried enormous weight, and Isaac's obvious qualifications soon silenced most criticism. The Lucasian professorship, established just a few years earlier through the bequest of Henry Lucas, was specifically intended to support advanced work in mathematics and natural philosophy, and there was no one at Cambridge better qualified to fulfill this mission than Isaac, regardless of his youth and relative inexperience in academic politics. As Lucasian professor, Isaac was expected to deliver regular lectures on mathematical subjects and to pursue research that would advance the state of knowledge in his field. The position provided him with a comfortable income, secure tenure, and the freedom to investigate whatever problems seemed most interesting and important. More significantly, it gave him a platform from which to begin sharing the mathematical methods he had developed during his plague years, with a new generation of students who might be capable of extending and applying these techniques to problems throughout natural philosophy. Isaac's lectures as Lucasian professor were remarkable events, though not always in ways that made them popular with students. He would arrive at the appointed hour carrying carefully prepared notes and proceed to deliver highly technical presentations on advanced mathematical topics, often involving methods and concepts that were completely unknown outside of his own work. His exposition was clear and systematic, but the subject matter was so far beyond the normal Cambridge curriculum that many students found themselves completely lost within the first few minutes of each lecture. The lecture hall where Isaac delivered these presentations was one of the older rooms in the university, with high windows that cast dramatic beams of light across rows of wooden benches worn smooth by generations of students. On many occasions, Isaac would find himself delivering his advanced mathematical theories to an audience that dwindled as the lecture progressed, with students quietly slipping out the back door when the material became too challenging to follow. Sometimes he would finish his presentation to an audience of only 2 or 3 die-hard mathematical enthusiasts, though he continued his systematic exposition with the same careful attention to detail, regardless of how many people were listening. But the small number of students who did manage to follow Isaac's lectures found themselves exposed to mathematical methods of unprecedented power and generality. He introduced them to his techniques for handling infinite series, for calculating areas and volumes of complex shapes, and for analyzing motion and change using what he called the method of fluxions. These students, though few in number, would go on to become some of the leading mathematical minds of the next generation, carrying Isaac's methods throughout Europe and establishing the foundations for modern mathematical analysis. Outside the lecture hall, Isaac continued to pursue his own research with the same intensity and systematic approach that had characterized his plague years at Woolsthorpe. His position as Lucasian professor provided him with resources that had been unavailable during his student days: access to the finest books and instruments, correspondence with leading scholars throughout Europe, and the leisure necessary for sustained investigation of fundamental problems. He used these advantages to continue developing his theories of mechanics and gravitation, refining his mathematical methods, and conducting increasingly sophisticated optical experiments. One of the most important developments during this period was Isaac's growing correspondence with other leading mathematicians and natural philosophers throughout Europe. The Republic of Letters, as it was sometimes called, was an informal international community of scholars who shared their discoveries and ideas through an extensive network of personal correspondence. Letters would travel slowly across the continent, carrying news of experimental results, theoretical insights, and mathematical innovations from one center of learning to another. Isaac found himself drawn into this network, both as a recipient of information about work being done elsewhere and as a contributor of his own discoveries and methods. Among his most important correspondents was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a brilliant German mathematician and philosopher who was working on problems very similar to those that had occupied Isaac's attention during his Cambridge years. Leibniz had independently developed mathematical methods for handling rates of change in infinite processes, though his approach was somewhat different from Isaac's and used different notation and terminology. The parallel development of these ideas by two such different thinkers provided strong evidence that the methods represented fundamental advances in mathematical understanding rather than merely clever tricks applicable to limited classes of problems. The correspondence between Isaac and Leibniz was initially cordial and mutually beneficial, with each scholar learning from the other's approaches and insights, but it contained the seeds of future conflict, as questions about priority and credit for mathematical innovations would eventually lead to one of the most bitter controversies in the history of science. For now, however, the exchange of ideas was stimulating and productive, helping both men to refine and extend their mathematical methods and to see new applications for their techniques in natural philosophy. During the 1670s, Isaac also began to develop his ideas about universal gravitation into a more complete and systematic theory. Building on his early insights about the relationship between terrestrial and celestial mechanics, he worked out the mathematical implications of assuming that every particle of matter in the universe attracts every other particle with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This seemingly simple proposition had profound consequences for understanding planetary motion, tidal phenomena, and a host of other effects that had previously been explained through separate and unrelated theories. The mathematical challenges involved in working out these implications were enormous, requiring Isaac to develop new techniques for handling problems involving multiple interacting bodies and complex orbital geometries. He had to learn to calculate the gravitational effects of extended objects like planets and moons, which could not be treated as simple point masses when high precision was required. He had to work out the perturbations that planets exerted on each other's orbits, effects that were small but measurable with the astronomical observations available in his time. Perhaps most challenging of all, Isaac had to confront the philosophical and theological implications of a theory that suggested the entire universe was governed by impersonal mathematical laws, rather than by the direct intervention of divine providence. The mechanical worldview that emerged from his gravitational theory seemed to leave little room for the active involvement of God in the day-to-day operations of the cosmos, a conclusion that troubled Isaac's deeply religious nature and that would trouble many of his contemporaries when his ideas eventually became widely known. As the 1670s progressed, Isaac found himself pulled in multiple directions by the demands of his position, his research interests, and his growing involvement in the broader scientific community. The Royal Society continued to seek his participation in its activities, and he was frequently called upon to referee disputes between other natural philosophers or to provide expert opinions on experimental claims and theoretical innovations. These responsibilities were time-consuming and often involved him in controversies that he would have preferred to avoid, but they also helped to establish his reputation as one of the leading scientific authorities of his generation. At the same time, Isaac was becoming increasingly interested in alchemical investigations, a pursuit that might seem inconsistent with his rigorous mathematical approach to natural philosophy, but that actually complemented his other work in important ways. Alchemy in the 17th century was not simply the crude search for methods of transmuting base metals into gold that it is often portrayed as today, but rather a sophisticated attempt to understand the fundamental nature of matter and the processes by which different substances could be transformed into one another. Isaac's alchemical studies were conducted with the same systematic rigor that he brought to all his investigations, though he was necessarily more secretive about this work because alchemy occupied a somewhat ambiguous position in the intellectual culture of his time. He built a small laboratory in the garden behind his rooms at Trinity College, where he could conduct experiments involving the heating, distillation, and chemical transformation of various materials without attracting unwanted attention from college authorities or curious colleagues. Working often late into the night by the light of furnace fires, Isaac explored the properties of metals, acids, and other substances, seeking to understand the principles that governed chemical change. These alchemical investigations were not separate from Isaac's other scientific work, but rather formed part of a comprehensive attempt to understand all aspects of the natural world through careful observation and mathematical analysis. The same forces that govern the motions of planets might also be responsible for the chemical affinities that cause different substances to combine or separate under various conditions. The same mathematical methods that could describe optical phenomena might also be applicable to understanding the behavior of matter during chemical transformations. The 1680s brought a new phase in Isaac's career, as external events conspired to draw him more fully into the public sphere and to accelerate the development and publication of his gravitational theory. The catalyst for these changes was a visit to Cambridge by the young astronomer Edmund Halley, who had been investigating problems related to planetary motion and had become frustrated by the mathematical difficulties involved in working out the implications of an inverse square law of gravitational attraction. Halley had heard rumours about Isaac's work on gravitation and mechanics, and he made the journey to Cambridge specifically to discuss these matters with the Lucasian professor. When he arrived at Isaac's rooms in Trinity College on that fateful day in 1684, he found a middle-aged scholar surrounded by books, papers, and experimental apparatus, working with characteristic intensity on problems that had occupied his attention for nearly 20 years. The conversation that ensued would change the course of scientific history and lead directly to the publication of one of the most important books ever written about the natural world. Halley's questions were direct and challenging. Assuming that the planets were attracted to the Sun by a force that varied inversely with the square of their distance from the central body, what shape of orbit would result? Isaac's answer was immediate and confident: an ellipse. When Halley asked how he could be so certain, Isaac replied that he had calculated it years earlier during his initial investigations of gravitational theory. But when Halley pressed for details and asked to see the calculation, Isaac was unable to locate the relevant papers among the masses of material that filled his study. Promising to reconstruct the demonstration and send it to Halley in London, Isaac set about not merely reproducing his earlier calculation, but developing it into a comprehensive treatment of orbital mechanics that would address all the questions that had been troubling astronomers and mathematicians for decades. What began as a simple promise to provide a single mathematical derivation gradually expanded into a systematic exposition of the principles of mechanics and their application to celestial phenomena, terrestrial physics, and a host of other natural effects. Working with remarkable speed and concentration, Isaac produced a short treatise called De Motu Corporum in Dirum on the motion of bodies in orbit, which he sent to Halley in November of 1684. This work contained the essential ideas of what would eventually become the Principia, including the three laws of motion, the inverse square law of gravitation, and mathematical demonstrations of Kepler's laws of planetary motion as consequences of gravitational attraction. Halley recognized immediately that he was looking at work of extraordinary importance and originality, representing advances that would transform natural philosophy and establish it on secure mathematical foundations for the first time. Halley's enthusiasm and encouragement proved crucial in persuading Isaac to expand his treatment into a comprehensive book that would present his mechanical and gravitational theories in full detail. Isaac had always been reluctant to publish his work, partly because of his natural inclination toward privacy and partly because of his unpleasant experiences with scientific controversy during the 1670s. But Halley's persistence and his offer to handle all the practical arrangements for publication eventually overcame Isaac's reluctance, and in the summer of 1685, Isaac began the intensive work of writing what would become the Principia Mathematica. The process of composition was extraordinarily demanding, requiring Isaac to develop not only the mathematical techniques necessary for handling complex mechanical problems, but also new methods of exposition that could make his advanced methods accessible to readers trained in traditional approaches to natural philosophy. He had to construct careful definitions of fundamental concepts like mass, force, space, and time that had been used loosely by previous writers, but that needed precise mathematical formulation if they were to serve as the foundation for exact science. He had to develop systematic methods for analyzing the motion of bodies under the influence of various kinds of forces, from simple uniform attraction to complex interactions between multiple objects. Perhaps most challenging of all, Isaac had to work out the implications of his gravitational theory for a vast range of phenomena that had never before been understood in terms of a single, unified physical principle. The tides, which had been explained through various ad hoc hypotheses involving lunar and solar influences, could now be understood as consequences of differential gravitational attraction. The precession of the equinoxes, a slow change in the orientation of the Earth's axis that had puzzled astronomers since ancient times, could be explained as resulting from gravitational forces exerted by the Sun and Moon on the Earth's equatorial bulge. The orbits of comets, which had seemed to follow no discernible pattern, could be understood as elongated ellipses governed by the same laws that controlled planetary motion. Working in the quiet of his Cambridge study, often for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch, Isaac gradually constructed a comprehensive mathematical description of the physical universe that was breathtaking in its scope and elegance. The 3 books that comprised the Principia moved systematically from fundamental definitions and axioms through increasingly complex applications, culminating in treatments of fluid mechanics, wave motion, and the orbital dynamics of the solar system that solved problems that had challenged the greatest minds of previous centuries. The first book, De Motu Corporum, on the motion of bodies, established the mathematical foundations of mechanics, presenting the 3 laws of motion and showing how they could be applied to understand the behavior of individual particles and extended bodies under various conditions. The second book dealt with motion in resisting media, analyzing how friction and other forms of resistance affected the movement of objects through fluids and gases. The third book, De Mundi Systemate, on the system of the world, applied the principles developed in the earlier sections to astronomical phenomena, demonstrating that the same laws that governed falling apples on Earth also controlled the motions of planets, moons, and comets throughout the solar system. The mathematical sophistication required to follow Isaac's arguments was considerable, involving not only his own calculus methods, though these were presented in geometric form to make them more accessible to contemporary readers, but also advanced techniques from algebra, geometry, and what we would now call differential equations. Isaac assumed that his readers were familiar with classical Greek geometry and with the astronomical observations that had been accumulated over centuries of careful observation, but he provided enough detail and explanation that a dedicated student could work through his demonstrations and verify his conclusions for themselves. As the manuscript of the Principia neared completion in 1686, Isaac began to face the practical challenges of arranging for its publication. Books in the 17th century were expensive to produce and often required financial backing from wealthy patrons or institutions willing to underwrite the costs of printing, binding, and distribution. Halley, true to his earlier promises, took responsibility for finding a publisher and arranging the financial support necessary to bring Isaac's work to the public, even going so far as to pay many of the publication costs out of his own pocket when other sources of funding proved inadequate. The Royal Society, despite its obvious interest in seeing Isaac's work published, was experiencing financial difficulties and was unable to provide the support that might normally have been expected from such an organization. The Society had recently lost money on a lavishly illustrated natural history of fishes that had failed to sell well, and its treasury was insufficient to support another major publication project. This situation left Halley to shoulder the financial burden personally, a sacrifice that demonstrated his extraordinary commitment to seeing Isaac's work reach the broader scientific community. Finally, in July of 1687, nearly 3 years after Halley's initial visit to Cambridge had set the entire project in motion, the first copies of Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, emerged from the printing house of Joseph Streeter in London. The book was a substantial volume of more than 500 pages, printed in Latin, and filled with geometric diagrams and mathematical demonstrations that represented the culmination of Isaac's 20 years of intensive work on problems of motion and gravitation. The initial reception of the Principia was a mixture of awe, bewilderment, and gradual recognition of its extraordinary significance. The mathematical sophistication of Isaac's work meant that only a handful of scholars throughout Europe possessed the technical background necessary to follow his arguments in detail. But those who could understand his demonstrations recognized immediately that they were witnessing a fundamental transformation in human understanding of the physical world. Here was a single theoretical framework that could explain everything from the fall of an apple to the orbit of a comet, from the rhythm of ocean tides to the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis. Edmund Halley, who had done so much to bring the work to publication, was among the first to grasp its full implications. He wrote a poem in Latin that was printed as a preface to the book, celebrating Isaac's achievement in verses that compared him to the great figures of classical antiquity, and suggested that his work represented a pinnacle of human intellectual accomplishment. The poem spoke of Isaac as one who had revealed the hidden architecture of the cosmos, who had shown that the same divine reason that had created the universe had also provided human beings with minds capable of comprehending its fundamental laws. Other early readers included some of the finest mathematical minds in Europe, scholars who had been working on similar problems and who could appreciate the elegance and power of Isaac's solutions. John Bernoulli in Basel, Christian Huygens in The Hague, and members of the Paris Academy of Sciences all received copies of the Principia and began the careful study necessary to master its contents. Their letters and published comments helped to spread awareness of Isaac's work throughout the international community of natural philosophers, establishing his reputation as the leading mathematical scientist of his generation. But the very sophistication that made the Principia so remarkable also limited its immediate impact on the broader educated public. Unlike some scientific works that could be appreciated by any literate person, Isaac's book required years of mathematical training to understand properly, and even then demanded sustained effort and concentration from its readers. The geometric presentation, while more accessible than Isaac's original calculus methods would have been, still assumed familiarity with advanced mathematical techniques that were known only to a small number of specialists in each country. This situation created something of a paradox in Isaac's growing fame. He was increasingly recognized as a figure of extraordinary importance, someone who had achieved intellectual breakthroughs of fundamental significance. Yet the actual content of his work remained mysterious to all but a tiny elite of mathematical experts. Popular accounts of the Principia focused on its dramatic conclusions that the same force governed terrestrial and celestial motion, that the universe operated according to precise mathematical laws, that human reason could comprehend the hidden mechanisms of creation, while necessarily glossing over the technical details that supported these revolutionary claims. Isaac himself remained characteristically modest about his achievements, viewing the Principia not as a complete solution to all mechanical problems, but rather as a foundation upon which future investigators could build. He was acutely aware of the limitations in his theory, particularly the fact that he had been unable to explain the ultimate nature of gravitational attraction itself. His mathematical description of how gravitational forces behaved was precise and comprehensive, but he freely admitted that he could offer no satisfactory explanation for why such forces should exist, or how they could act across the vast empty spaces that separated celestial bodies. This gap in his theory troubled Isaac deeply, as it seemed to leave room for criticism from philosophers who preferred mechanical explanations based on the direct contact between material particles. Descartes and his followers had argued that all natural phenomena should be explicable in terms of matter in motion, with forces transmitted through direct collision or through the pressure exerted by invisible fluids that filled all of space. Isaac's gravitational attraction seemed to require some form of mysterious action at a distance that violated these mechanical principles, though it undeniably produced accurate predictions of natural phenomena. The years following the publication of the Principia brought Isaac increasing recognition and social elevation, but also new responsibilities and challenges that pulled him away from the pure research that had always been his greatest passion. Cambridge University, proud of having such a distinguished faculty member, began to call upon him for various administrative duties and ceremonial functions. The broader English academic community sought his opinions on educational policy and scientific institutions. Government officials occasionally consulted him on technical matters ranging from military engineering to coinage and monetary policy. One of the most significant changes in Isaac's circumstances came in 1696, when he was offered the position of Warden of the Royal Mint, the government institution responsible for producing England's coins and maintaining the integrity of its currency. This appointment represented a major career transition, requiring Isaac to leave his comfortable academic position at Cambridge and take up residence in London, where he would be responsible for overseeing the complex technical and administrative operations of one of the most important government departments. The offer came at a time when the English monetary system was facing serious challenges from counterfeiters and coiners, who were undermining public confidence in the currency by producing false or debased coins. The government needed someone with both the technical expertise to understand the complex metallurgical processes involved in coinage, and the administrative capability to manage a large workforce and coordinate with other government departments. Isaac's reputation for precision, integrity, and systematic thinking made him an ideal candidate for this demanding position. The decision to accept the appointment was not easy for Isaac, who had spent his entire adult life in the quiet, contemplative environment of Cambridge, and who valued his freedom to pursue research according to his own interests and schedule. The Mint position would involve him in the rough-and-tumble world of government service, with its political pressures, bureaucratic complications, and constant demands for immediate practical solutions to pressing problems. It would also require him to spend considerable time on administrative tasks that, while important, were far removed from the mathematical and experimental investigations that had always been his primary passion. But there were compelling reasons to accept the offer beyond the substantial salary increase it represented. The Mint position would provide Isaac with financial security for his later years and would free him from the need to continue the lecturing and tutorial duties that had never been particularly congenial to his temperament. More importantly, it would give him an opportunity to apply his scientific knowledge to practical problems of national importance, contributing to the economic stability and prosperity of his country while continuing to pursue his own research interests in his spare time. Isaac's work at the Royal Mint proved to be remarkably successful, demonstrating that his talents extended far beyond pure theoretical investigation to include practical problem-solving and administrative leadership. He approached the challenges of coinage with the same systematic methodology that had characterized his scientific work, studying every aspect of the Mint's operations from the procurement of raw materials through the final distribution of finished coins. He introduced new quality control procedures that reduced waste and improved consistency, developed more efficient production methods that increased output while maintaining high standards, and implemented security measures that made counterfeiting much more difficult. Perhaps most notably, Isaac took personal responsibility for pursuing and prosecuting counterfeiters, a task that required him to develop skills in criminal investigation that had no precedent in his academic background. He conducted interviews with suspected coiners, gathered evidence about their methods and networks, and testified in court proceedings that often resulted in severe punishments for those convicted of currency crimes. This work brought him into contact with London's criminal underworld, a milieu as different from the scholarly atmosphere of Cambridge as could possibly be imagined, yet Isaac approached these challenges with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his scientific investigations. The contrast between Isaac's daytime responsibilities at the Mint and his evening pursuits in his private study created a remarkable duality in his later life. During working hours, he was immersed in the practical concerns of government administration, monitoring silver prices, coordinating with treasury officials, overseeing the production schedules that ensured adequate supplies of coins for commercial use. But when he returned to his lodgings each evening, he would often spend hours reading, calculating, and corresponding with natural philosophers throughout Europe, continuing the intellectual work that remained his deepest source of satisfaction and meaning. One area that particularly occupied Isaac's attention during his London years was the continuing development of his optical theories and their practical applications. The reflecting telescope he had invented during his plague years at Woolsthorpe had proven to be just the beginning of a long series of innovations in optical instrumentation, and Isaac continued to refine his understanding of how light behaved under various conditions. He conducted experiments with prisms and lenses in a small laboratory he established in his London residence, exploring phenomena such as diffraction and interference that would later prove central to understanding the wave nature of light. These optical investigations led Isaac to write his second major scientific work, The Optics, which was published in English in 1704 rather than in the Latin that had been traditional for serious scientific treatises. This decision to use the vernacular reflected Isaac's desire to make his optical discoveries accessible to a broader audience of educated readers who might not be comfortable with technical Latin, but who could appreciate experimental demonstrations of natural phenomena. The Optics was written in a more accessible style than the Principia, with less emphasis on mathematical demonstration and more attention to experimental procedures and empirical results. The Optics presented Isaac's discoveries about the nature of white light and color in systematic detail, describing the experiments with prisms that had revealed the composite nature of sunlight and the principles underlying the operation of telescopes, microscopes, and other optical instruments. But the book went beyond these established results to explore more speculative questions about the fundamental nature of light itself, the relationship between optical phenomena and other branches of natural philosophy, and the possibility that light might consist of streams of tiny particles rather than waves propagating through a mysterious medium. The publication of the Optics further enhanced Isaac's reputation as England's leading natural philosopher, establishing him as an authority not only in mathematical sciences, but also in experimental investigation and practical applications of scientific knowledge. The book was widely read and discussed throughout Europe, translated into Latin and other languages, and used as a textbook in universities that were beginning to incorporate experimental science into their curricula. It demonstrated that Isaac's scientific talents were not limited to the rarefied realm of celestial mechanics, but extended to all areas of natural philosophy, where careful observation and systematic reasoning could reveal the hidden laws governing natural phenomena, but success in the public sphere also brought Isaac into conflicts and controversies that he would have preferred to avoid. His growing fame made him a target for critics who questioned his theories, challenged his priority claims, or simply sought to enhance their own reputations by association with or opposition to such a prominent figure. The most serious of these disputes involved Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician with whom Isaac had corresponded cordially for many years, but who was now being promoted by his supporters as the true inventor of the calculus. The calculus controversy, as it came to be known, grew out of legitimate questions about the relative contributions of Isaac and Leibniz to the development of mathematical methods for handling problems involving rates of change and infinite processes. Both men had indeed made fundamental discoveries in this area, working largely independently and using different notation and approaches. Under normal circumstances, such parallel discoveries might have been celebrated as evidence of the robust nature of mathematical truth, with credit shared between the two innovators according to their respective contributions. But the situation was complicated by national rivalries, personal ambitions, and institutional politics that transformed a technical dispute about mathematical history into a bitter personal feud that consumed enormous amounts of energy and attention from both principals. Leibniz's supporters in Germany and other parts of continental Europe argued that their hero had published his calculus methods before Isaac, and therefore deserved primary credit for the discovery. Isaac's defenders in England countered that their champion had developed his techniques earlier, even if he had been slower to publish them, and that Leibniz had likely learned the essential ideas from Isaac's correspondence before developing his own version. Isaac himself was reluctantly drawn into this controversy, which violated his natural preference for avoiding public disputes and focusing on substantive scientific work, but questions about his intellectual integrity and the originality of his mathematical discoveries touched on issues that were central to his identity as a scholar, and he felt compelled to defend his reputation against what he regarded as unfair and inaccurate attacks. The dispute dragged on for years, involving supporters on both sides in increasingly acrimonious exchanges that generated far more heat than light, and that ultimately did little credit to anyone involved. The stress and distraction of the calculus controversy was compounded by Isaac's growing involvement in the affairs of the Royal Society, which elected him as its president in 1703 following the death of Robert Hooke, his old antagonist from the optical debates of the 1670s. The presidency of the Royal Society was both an honour and a burden, recognising Isaac's status as England's most distinguished natural philosopher, while requiring him to take responsibility for the organisation's scientific activities, financial management, and relationships with government officials and foreign academies. Under Isaac's leadership, the Royal Society flourished as never before, attracting distinguished fellows, publishing important scientific works, and serving as a model for similar organisations throughout Europe. Isaac used his position to encourage experimental investigation, to maintain high standards for scientific publication, and to foster international cooperation among natural philosophers who shared common interests despite political and religious differences between their countries. His weekly meetings as president became important social and intellectual events in London, bringing together the finest scientific minds in England for discussions that often continued long into the evening. But the administrative responsibilities of the presidency also consumed time and energy that Isaac might have preferred to devote to his own research. The society required constant attention to financial matters, as its income from membership dues was often insufficient to cover the costs of publication and other activities. Meetings had to be planned and conducted according to established procedures, with careful attention to protocol and parliamentary procedure. Correspondence with foreign academies and individual scholars had to be maintained, requiring Isaac to stay informed about scientific developments throughout Europe and to represent English science in international forums. Despite these various demands on his time, Isaac continued to pursue his own investigations in mathematics, optics, and what we might now call theoretical physics. He refined his gravitational theory by working out more precise calculations of planetary perturbations, tidal effects, and cometary orbits. He conducted experiments on heat, magnetism, and chemical phenomena, seeking to understand whether these effects might be governed by the same kinds of forces that controlled mechanical motion. He maintained an extensive correspondence with natural philosophers throughout Europe, sharing his latest discoveries and learning about experimental results and theoretical developments that might bear on his own work. One area that increasingly occupied Isaac's attention during his later years was the question of absolute versus relative motion, a problem that had profound implications for understanding the nature of space and time themselves. His gravitational theory had been formulated in terms of absolute spatial coordinates and absolute temporal intervals, assuming that these quantities had objective reality independent of any particular observer or reference frame. But critics had argued that all motion was necessarily relative to some chosen standard, and that concepts of absolute space and time were metaphysically problematic, if not actually meaningless. Isaac defended his position by arguing that certain kinds of motion, particularly rotational motion, produced observable physical effects that could not be explained if all motion were purely relative. His famous thought experiment involving a rotating bucket of water demonstrated that the surface of the water became curved even when the bucket and water were rotating together with no relative motion between them, suggesting that the water was somehow responding to its motion relative to absolute space rather than to any material reference frame. These philosophical questions about the nature of space, time, and motion would continue to puzzle scientists and philosophers for centuries after Isaac's death, eventually leading to Einstein's theories of relativity that transformed our understanding of these fundamental concepts in ways that Isaac could never have anticipated. But during his own lifetime, Isaac's views on these matters were generally accepted by his followers as natural consequences of his successful gravitational theory, and they provided a metaphysical framework that seemed adequate for understanding mechanical phenomena throughout the solar system. As Isaac entered his 70s, he began to reduce somewhat his involvement in active scientific research while maintaining his responsibilities at the Royal Mint and the Royal Society. His health remained generally good, though he experienced occasional episodes of illness that reminded him of his advancing age and the need to consider his legacy and the future of the scientific work he had pioneered. He took increasing satisfaction in the accomplishments of younger natural philosophers who were extending and applying his methods to new problems, seeing in their successes a vindication of the approaches he had developed and promoted throughout his career. The last decades of Isaac's life were marked by growing public recognition of his achievements and their significance for human understanding of the natural world. He was knighted by Queen Anne in 1705, becoming Sir Isaac Newton in recognition of his contributions to science and his service to the nation through his work at the Royal Mint. This honour was unprecedented for someone whose fame rested primarily on intellectual rather than military or political accomplishments, reflecting the growing appreciation for the practical importance of scientific knowledge and the cultural prestige that natural philosophy was beginning to acquire. Foreign academies and universities competed to offer Isaac honorary memberships and degrees, recognizing him as a figure of international importance whose work transcended national boundaries and political divisions. The Academy of Sciences in Paris, despite the ongoing political tensions between France and England, elected him as one of their foreign associates, acknowledging that scientific truth was universal and that intellectual excellence deserved recognition regardless of nationality. Similar honours came from institutions throughout Europe, establishing Isaac as perhaps the first truly international scientific celebrity. But Isaac himself remained characteristically modest about these accolades, viewing them as recognition of the importance of natural philosophy as a whole, rather than as tributes to his personal genius. In private conversations with friends and colleagues, he often emphasized how much his work had depended on the discoveries and insights of previous generations of investigators, comparing himself to someone who had seen farther than others, only because he had stood on the shoulders of giants. This humility was genuine rather than false modesty, reflecting Isaac's deep appreciation for the collaborative nature of scientific investigation and his awareness that his own contributions, however significant, were part of a much larger human enterprise. As his 80th birthday approached in 1722, Isaac began to experience more frequent episodes of illness and physical discomfort that made it difficult for him to maintain his previous level of activity. He gradually reduced his involvement in the day-to-day operations of the Royal Mint, though he retained his title and continued to receive his salary in recognition of his many years of faithful service. His appearances at Royal Society meetings became less frequent, though he maintained his interest in the organization's activities and continued to influence its policies through correspondence and consultation with other officers. The peaceful routine of Isaac's final years was centered around his comfortable residence in London, where he was cared for by his niece Catherine Barton and her family. Catherine had served as his housekeeper and companion for many years, managing his domestic affairs and providing the stable social environment that allowed him to focus on his intellectual work. She was an intelligent and well-educated woman who understood the importance of her uncle's scientific achievements and who took pride in facilitating the conditions necessary for his continued productivity. Isaac's daily routine during these final years followed a pattern that had remained largely unchanged for decades. He would rise early, often before dawn, and spend the quiet morning hours reading, writing, or conducting calculations related to problems that continued to interest him. After a simple breakfast, he might spend time in his study working on correspondence or reviewing manuscripts submitted to the Royal Society for publication. Afternoons were often devoted to receiving visitors, younger scientists seeking advice, government officials consulting on technical matters, or distinguished foreigners who wished to pay their respects to England's most famous natural philosopher. Evenings were typically quiet, spent in reading or conversation with family members and close friends. Isaac remained intellectually active almost to the end of his life, continuing to think about fundamental questions in mathematics and natural philosophy even when his physical strength was declining. He worked on revisions to new editions of both the Principia and the Optics, incorporating improvements suggested by recent experimental results and theoretical developments. He maintained his correspondence with natural philosophers throughout Europe, though his letters became shorter and less frequent as writing became more physically demanding. On March 20, 1727, at the age of 84, Sir Isaac Newton passed away peacefully in his London home, surrounded by family members and close friends who had been with him during his final illness. His death was mourned throughout England, and indeed throughout the entire European intellectual community, as the loss of one of the greatest minds in human history. The funeral arrangements reflected the extraordinary esteem in which he was held, with his body lying in state in Westminster Abbey before burial in a place of honour among England's most distinguished citizens. The funeral itself was attended by representatives of the royal family, government officials, members of parliament, and natural philosophers from throughout Europe who had travelled to London to pay their final respects. The eulogy delivered at the service emphasised not only Isaac's specific scientific achievements, but also his role in establishing new standards of intellectual rigour and empirical investigation that were transforming human understanding of the natural world. He was praised as someone who had demonstrated the power of human reason to comprehend the fundamental laws governing the universe, while remaining humble before the ultimate mysteries of existence. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Isaac's memory was the continuing vitality and productivity of the scientific tradition he had helped to establish. Throughout Europe, natural philosophers were applying his mathematical methods to new problems, extending his mechanical theories to previously unexplored phenomena, and using his experimental techniques to investigate areas of nature that he had barely begun to examine. The Royal Society continued to flourish under the principles he had championed during his presidency, serving as a model for similar organizations in other countries and maintaining the international network of correspondence that facilitated the rapid spread of scientific knowledge. In the quiet countryside of Lincolnshire, the ancient manor house at Woolsthorpe still stood much as it had during Isaac's childhood, though it was now recognized as a place of historical significance rather than simply another rural estate. The apple orchard behind the house continued to bloom each spring and bear fruit each autumn, its trees perhaps descendants of the one whose falling fruit had inspired Isaac's first insights into the nature of gravitation. Visitors occasionally made pilgrimages to this peaceful spot, seeking to understand something of the environment that had nurtured one of history's most remarkable minds. The legacy of Isaac Newton's life and work would continue to unfold for centuries after his death, as each new generation of scientists built upon the foundations he had established and extended human knowledge into realms he could never have imagined. His mathematical methods would evolve into the sophisticated calculus that became essential for all advanced scientific investigation. His mechanical theories would provide the framework for understanding everything from the behavior of microscopic particles to the evolution of stellar systems. His experimental techniques would inspire countless investigators to probe the secrets of nature with the same combination of theoretical insight and empirical rigor that had characterized his own approach to natural philosophy. And so we reach the end of our peaceful journey through the life of Sir Isaac Newton, this remarkable man who changed forever our understanding of the universe and our place within it. From his humble beginnings in a small Lincolnshire village to his final years as England's most celebrated natural philosopher, Isaac's story is one of intellectual courage, systematic investigation, and profound insight into the mathematical principles that govern all natural phenomena. His life reminds us that the greatest discoveries often emerge from quiet contemplation, careful observation, and the patient application of reason to the enduring mysteries that surround us. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, perhaps you might imagine yourself walking through that peaceful orchard at Woolsthorpe, where the apple trees still bloom and fruit as they did in Isaac's time, where the same forces that governed his falling apple continue to shape the motions of distant galaxies, and where the eternal quest for understanding continues in the work of each new generation of curious minds. The universe that Isaac helped us to comprehend remains as beautiful and mysterious as ever, filled with wonders that await discovery by those who possess his combination of mathematical skill, experimental ingenuity, and humble reverence for the profound truths that lie hidden within the natural world. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the same sense of wonder and possibility that guided Isaac Newton throughout his extraordinary life. Thank you so very much for joining me on this gentle journey through history, and I wish you the most restful and peaceful of nights ahead. Good night.